34 years ago, a teenage girl vanished on what should have been an ordinary spring afternoon in Savannah, Georgia. For more than 2 decades, her family lived in silence. No clues, no answers, only the aching void she left behind. Then one day, her father opened an old yearbook tucked away in her untouched bedroom. And inside, he found a detail that everyone else had overlooked. A detail that would unravel buried secrets, ignite a dangerous chase, and finally reveal a chilling truth no one was prepared to face. Before we dive into this heartbreaking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the mysteries we uncover here on Twilight Stories. In the spring of 1990, in the warm southern city of Savannah, Georgia, a teenage girl named Jamila Brown vanished without a trace. What should have been an ordinary afternoon turned into the darkest chapter of her family's life, leaving her parents, Maurice and Lorraine, frozen in an endless cycle of grief. For over 2 decades, they lived with silence, no answers, no witnesses, no body, only the unbearable absence of the daughter they loved. Then, 22 years later, everything shifted when Maurice dared to open something that had been untouched all this time. Jamila's old high school yearbook. The discovery would pull him into a web of hidden truths and long-buried secrets that no one was prepared to face. That morning, sunlight streamed through sheer curtains in their modest Savannah home, painting the room with streaks of gold. Maurice stood at the threshold of Jamila's bedroom, a place preserved like a time capsule. Posters of 80s pop icons still clung to faded blue walls, curling at the corners with age. On the neatly made bed lay her sea-green comforter and a threadbare teddy bear, its fur worn smooth by years of her touch. At the floor's edge sat her white and purple running shoes, bows tied neatly as though she had meant to wear them the next day. Maurice stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, as if the room itself recognized the weight of his grief. He had not entered in over 10 years, not since the last time he tried to catch her scent from the clothes in the closet. Even now, faint traces lingered, a mix of mango shampoo and the musty sweetness of old notebook paper. The familiar ache clenched his chest. This room had once pulsed with her laughter, her music, her ambitions. Now it had become a sanctuary of sorrow, a shrine to what had been lost. Lorraine had told him the night before. It was time. Time to let go. Time to stop pretending Jamila would walk back through the door. Their daughter was gone, and after every lead the police had pursued, had collapsed into silence. The truth was a void they had never learned to fill. Maurice moved toward the desk, dust softening its surface, as though the years had been keeping count. Stacks of notebooks sat neatly in place, colored pencils in a chipped mug, and an embroidered strip of fabric marked the pages of an old biology textbook. He lowered himself into her swivel chair, running his fingers over the dents she had left in the wood from nights spent studying. Slowly he began sorting her things, one box for donations, one for storage, one for treasures too dear to part with. Each item carried a memory folded into it. A homecoming t-shirt, a friendship bracelet, the corsage from her junior prom pressed into a plastic sleeve. With every touch, the past returned in flashes, her laughter ringing on a summer field trip, her tears when she didn't make the track team. Then, buried among the keepsakes, Maurice found something unexpected. A maroon yearbook, Jefferson High, class of 1990. Its spine was cracked but still strong, as though it had been waiting. Neither he nor Lorraine had ever dared to look at it before. The sight of Jamila's smiling face, frozen in time, had once been too unbearable. But today, Courage guided him. Today was about facing the past, no matter how much it hurt. He carried the book to her bed, flipping through photographs of pep rallies, proms, and yearbook staff. Finally, he stopped. There she was, Jamila's portrait, eyes bright with confidence, wearing a dark turtleneck and gold earrings. Beneath her photo, the caption declared her dream. Future marine biologist. Thanks to my parents, Ms. Glover, and my girl Kendra. Return my copy of The Secret Garden, or I'll haunt you forever. Maurice let out a broken laugh, wiping the sting from his eyes. That book had been her favorite, a story she read again and again, but the illustrated edition she mentioned was nowhere on her shelf. Something inside him stirred. He flipped to Kendra's page, Jamila's best friend, practically another daughter in their home during those years. Kendra's smiling face greeted him, so familiar yet distant, a reminder of how quickly people had disappeared from their lives after Jamila vanished. Grief made friends falter. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Conversations dried up. Slowly, the Browns were left alone with their silence. But now, staring at Kendra's portrait, Maurice felt a restlessness grow, because this yearbook seemed to be whispering that the story wasn't finished, and the truth, long hidden, might finally be ready to come to light. Maurice's eyes narrowed as he scanned the yearbook page again, his heart catching when he noticed a small set of numbers scrawled beneath Kendra's name. An old Savannah area code, followed by 7 digits. He knew after more than 2 decades the line was unlikely to work, but something urged him to try. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped the number into his cell phone. The dial tone lasted only a moment before an automated voice cut through. Disconnected. The hollow click echoed in his ear, but the unease inside him only deepened. Just then, the sound of the front. Doctor opening and closing drifted up from downstairs. Lorraine was back from the farmer's market, the shuffle of paper bags filling the silence. When she saw Morris descending the stairs with Jamila's yearbook pressed tight against his chest, her expression shifted. He explained what he had found. The note referencing the secret garden and the sense that it was more than an innocent reminder. Lorraine's face tightened. They had agreed to sort, to store, to let the room rest, not to stir the ashes of mysteries they had long been forced to live with. Maurice nodded, but the weight of unfinished business pressed harder. That yearbook wasn't just paper, it was a thread, the last visible link between his daughter and her best friend. When he asked Lorraine if she knew where Kendra was now, she hesitated. She recalled glimpsing her once near the downtown art center, whispers placing her in a trailer park not far from Bay Street. Before she could stop him, Maurice had his keys in hand, the yearbook tucked beneath his arm, and a resolve in his step that 22 years of grief could not weaken. The heavy southern air clung to his skin as he stepped outside. Heat shimmered off the pavement. Cicadas droned from the trees, and the scent of salt from the river carried on the wind. He slid into his car, the gravel crunching under the tires as he pulled away. Every mile forward was a mile against silence, against surrender. He had no guarantees that Kendra would remember, no certainty that the book meant anything more. But after 2 decades of waiting, he would follow even the faintest trail if it brought him 1 inch closer to the truth. The directions led him beyond Savannah's busy streets, out toward the edge of town where pine trees and wild brush framed a quiet trailer park. By the time he arrived, the afternoon light had softened, slanting through broken branches. The park was still except for a few distant barks of dogs and the hollow rattle of wind against loose siding. It didn't take long to spot Kendra Williams's trailer, a modest blue and white camper with a small ceramic owl perched above the door like a weary sentinel. Maurice parked across from it, gathering his breath, and walked forward with the yearbook pressed under his arm. When the door opened, he was struck by how time had etched itself onto her face. Kendra looked older, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, her expression cautious, almost guarded. But when Morris introduced himself, recognition softened her eyes. Inside, the camper was cramped, but tidy, filled with the faint aroma of coffee brewing on the stove. They sat at the built-in table, light spilling in from a narrow window. Maurice set the yearbook down between them. Kendra's gaze locked on it, her face tightening, as though the past had been placed squarely in front of her. When he flipped to the marked page and pointed at Jamila's handwritten note, Kendra hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she stood, opened a cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a hardback book, The Secret Garden, Illustrated Edition. The cover was worn, the spine slightly bent, but it was intact. She confessed she had never returned it. After Jamila disappeared, letting go of it had felt impossible. It was the last living thread to her best friend. Maurice accepted her words quietly and opened the book. Tucked inside was a makeshift bookmark, a glossy magazine clipping. The picture showed a teenage boy in a denim jacket and dark sunglasses, no older than 17. Maurice's stomach tightened as recognition flickered. He turned the page over, and the name printed near the spine confirmed it. Darius Hayes. The name hit him like a sudden echo of the past. Darius had been in Jamila's graduating class. Handsome, sure, but remembered less for his modeling gigs and more for the troubled whispers that followed him down the school hallways. Teachers had spoken his name with concern, administrators with frustration. Kendra leaned closer, her voice low but steady. She confirmed it was Darius and revealed something Morris hadn't known. Jamila had become curious about him in her final months at Jefferson High. It was unexpected. She and Kendra had never been close to him. Darius was the kind of boy who walked alone, with a reputation for manipulation, quick temper, and a sharp tongue. Yet Jamila had started asking questions: where he lived, what he did after school, whether he was really as dangerous as people claimed. Once, she even asked Kendra to drive past his house. Kendra had agreed, chalking it up to teenage curiosity. The memory chilled Maurice now. That quiet residential street across town was no ordinary place. It might have been the beginning of a path that had swallowed his daughter whole. Maurice carefully wrote the address into the margin of his notebook, his pen pressing harder than he realized, as if carving the information into permanence. He asked Kendra if anything else from those final weeks stood out. At first, she shook her head, but then her eyes flickered with memory. Jamila had begun pulling away, still present, but quieter, more inward. She filled pages of her journals, took long solitary walks, and seemed distracted even in their closest moments. Kendra recalled one brief mention of a conversation between Jamila and Darius near the school parking lot. Jamila had brushed it off as nothing, just small talk, but the tone in her voice had betrayed something unspoken. Morris pressed gently. Was she afraid? Kendra shook her head, not afraid, but cautious, watchful. Her laughter dimmed, her eyes occasionally carrying a far-off look. Subtle changes, too subtle at the time to raise alarm. But now each detail stacked into something heavier. Maurice closed the yearbook, slid the illustrated secret garden into his bag, and thanked Kendra for her honesty. Before he left, she handed him a photograph from their senior year. Two girls smiling against the ocean waves, arms slung across each other's shoulders. Maurice accepted it silently, the weight of memory pressing against his palm. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the thread forming in his mind. Jamila's sudden interest in Darius, the hidden clipping, the subtle shifts in her behavior. It wasn't proof, but it was direction. And after 22 years of emptiness, even a thread was worth following. Back behind the wheel, he stared at the address scribbled in his notebook. Records showed the house still existed. He hadn't told Lorraine yet. Why raise her hopes without substance? He needed to see it for himself. Turning the key, he guided his car through Savannah's sprawling neighborhoods, watching the streets change from worn brick roads to freshly paved cul-de-sacs lined with neat hedges and manicured lawns. Finally, he arrived. A beige two-story house stood at the end of the street, orderly and unremarkable, except for the black sedan resting in the driveway. Maurice parked across the street, gathered his breath, and walked toward the front door with the yearbook at his side. Before he could knock, the door opened. Standing framed in the fading light was Darius Hayes. Time had aged him into sharp edges softened by experience. Collared shirt, gray slacks, the controlled look of a man who built walls around his past. But Maurice recognized him instantly, every feature unchanged from the yearbook photo hidden in the novel. Their eyes locked, silence stretching between them until Maurice spoke, giving his full name, stating he was Jamila's father. Something shifted immediately. Darius's posture stiffened, his shoulders tense, the polished mask slipping away. His eyes narrowed, and his voice came sharp, almost biting. What did Maurice want? The defensiveness was clear, the irritation unmistakable. Maurice explained calmly, steady, even as his heart thundered, that he only wanted answers, to understand if Darius knew anything about his daughter. Darius cut him off quickly, claiming he barely remembered Jamila, that whatever words they exchanged in high school were insignificant. He insisted he had already told the police everything back in 1990, his tone sharp, impatient, as though brushing away a fly that had returned after too many years. Maurice kept his composure, but inside, his thoughts churned. The defensiveness in Darius's voice wasn't dismissal, it was resistance, and resistance always meant something was being hidden. Maurice steadied his breath, trying to keep his voice calm, as he told Darius he had recently come across something that reopened questions long left buried. But Darius cut him off with the same cold insistence. He and Jamila were never close, certainly not involved, and anyone suggesting otherwise was mistaken. He claimed their conversations, if they even happened, were meaningless, just passing words about schoolwork. The more Maurice pressed, hoping for even the smallest acknowledgement, the more restless Darius became. His eyes darted toward the street, scanning for witnesses, his hands flexing at his sides like he was holding back something unspoken. He made it clear he resented the intrusion and accused Maurice of stirring up the past with no purpose. Then, without warning, Darius turned his back, retreating into the house and slamming the door shut, leaving Maurice alone on the porch, staring at the wood grain as unease twisted into suspicion. Walking back to his car, Maurice realized the encounter had confirmed nothing, yet revealed more than words ever could. Darius's defensiveness, his sharpness, his lack of even a trace of empathy, it all gnawed at Maurice's instincts. Still without a clear plan, he drove away, but not toward home. Instead, he pulled into the lot of Morningale Memorial Funeral Home. For years, he and Lorraine had avoided arranging a formal service, clinging to the impossible hope that Jamila might still walk back into their lives. Now he accepted the brochures silently, each one heavy with finality. It felt hollow, but necessary. Stepping back into the afternoon sun, something caught his attention across the street. His chest tightened as he saw the familiar figure of Darius Hayes emerge from a hardware store, arms burdened with a shovel and a wooden box wrapped in plastic. Maurice ducked behind a parked car, his heart pounding. Moments later, Darius walked into a flower shop. When he emerged, he carried a bouquet of white hyacinths, Jamila's favorite. Maurice's stomach clenched. He remembered the same flowers gracing her bedroom window and the way he placed them at her memorial bench every year. Watching Darius lay them gently in his trunk alongside the shovel and box was like watching a ghost handle something sacred. Darius drove off, and Maurice didn't hesitate. He followed at a careful distance as the black car slipped through Savannah's back streets and eventually veered toward the coast. The road wound toward Shell Bluff, a wind-swept, isolated stretch dotted with empty cottages outside Christmas season. Darius turned into the gravel drive of a small cottage perched at the cliff's edge. Maurice passed by, parked his sedan out of sight behind a wall of trees, and crept into the undergrowth to watch. Minutes ticked by before Darius reappeared, dragging a garden cart filled with the shovel, the wooden box, the bouquet of hyacinths, and a jug of water. Maurice trailed him at a distance, careful not to snap a twig or rustle a branch. The path wound to a rocky bluff overlooking the restless ocean, the wind sharp with salt. Hidden behind a cluster of trees, Maurice watched as Darius drove his shovel into the hard earth. Roots and stone resisted, but he worked steadily, digging deeper until the pit stretched 2 feet down. Then, with deliberate hands, he opened the box. Maurice couldn't see the contents, but he saw Darius linger, lifting papers and studying them, in silence. A gust of wind ripped across the bluff, sending a few pages tumbling into the air. Darius cursed under his breath, chasing them down, gathering them before stuffing them back. With slow reverence, he placed the bouquet into the box, closed the lid, and lowered it into the ground. Soil fell in waves from his shovel, tamped down firmly with his boots, then sealed with water from the jug until the earth lay smooth and compact. When the task was finished, Darius stood still, framed by the sound of waves crashing below. The breeze whispered through the trees as he bowed his head and spoke, his voice steady, almost tender. "You can hold these memories now, Jamila." The words struck Maurice like lightning. His entire body trembled, his breath caught in his chest. For the first time in 22 years, he wasn't standing in silence. He was standing on the edge of something hidden, something Darius clearly carried, and something Jamila had never been able to tell. Maurice shifted his weight just slightly, and the crunch of gravel betrayed him like a gunshot in the silence. Darius's head snapped toward the tree line, his eyes narrowing as he took cautious steps forward, shovel still gripped like a weapon. "Hello?" he called, his voice cutting through the salt-heavy air. Maurice's heart pounded so violently he feared it might give him away, but he remained frozen, hidden in the brush. For a long, tense moment, Darius searched, muttering to himself, before convincing his nerves it had only been the wind. He circled the clearing once, then retreated, leaving the tools against the cottage wall. The sound of his car engine fading down the road was the only sign Maurice needed. Adrenaline overriding the ache in his knees, he moved into the open and gripped the shovel, his hands trembling as he drove it into the still damp soil. The hyacinths emerged first, their white petals glowing faintly in the dusk. Just as he bent closer, a voice slashed the air. "I knew someone was out there." Maurice froze, the shovel still in his hands as he turned to face Darius, who stood at the edge of the clearing, rage and fear twisting his features. Maurice steadied his voice, demanding to know what had been buried, reminding Darius that he had spoken Jamila's name. Without waiting for an answer, Maurice turned back to the disturbed earth, intent on uncovering the truth. But Darius moved like lightning. He drew a handgun from his coat, raising it with both hands, ordering Maurice to drop the shovel. The metal clattered to the ground as Maurice raised his hands slowly, but in that heartbeat, he slipped one hand into his pocket, thumb pressing his phone's emergency SOS. Darius caught the motion, knocked the phone from his grip, and sent it skidding dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Maurice lunged forward in desperation, tackling Darius in a sudden burst of strength. The two men grappled violently in the dirt, their bodies colliding with the force of 2 decades of silence and suspicion. The gun slipped free, spinning into the darkness below as the ocean swallowed it whole. Gasping, Morris scrambled for his phone, dirt and gravel tearing at his palms. At the edge of the bluff, just before it slipped away forever, his fingers closed around it. He rolled onto his back, pressing the SOS button with all his strength until the alert pulsed through the night. Sirens would come. He just needed to survive until then. Darius staggered upright, his chest heaving as his fists clenched. Maurice rose to his knees, stalling, asking him outright, what had he done to Jamila? What truth had been buried for all these years? Darius said nothing, only lunged with terrifying force, knocking Maurice back to the ground and tightening his hands around the man's throat. The pressure cut off air, black spots blooming at the edges of Maurice's vision. His strength ebbed, the world closing in, until the shriek of sirens split the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, and the crack of officers' voices rang out. Darius faltered, hesitation flashing across his eyes. Maurice twisted free just as officers surged into the clearing, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Darius backed away, trembling, but offered no resistance as he was forced to the ground, cuffed, and led from the scene. Maurice sat gasping in the dirt, the taste of blood and salt on his lips. A young officer knelt beside him, asking if he was hurt. He shook his head, pointing toward the mound of earth. With urgency, detectives and forensic techs swarmed the site. Maurice stood off to the side, silent, as gloved hands uncovered what lay beneath the soil. The white hyacinths emerged first, their fragrance haunting in the night air. Beneath them lay the wooden box, the lid waiting to reveal whether 2 decades of torment were about to meet their reckoning. The wooden box creaked open beneath gloved hands, and the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Inside lay folded papers, aged photographs, and small personal items that time had not erased. The lead technician lifted each piece carefully, passing them to the detective. As the letters unfolded, their edges smudged by age and handling, a secret narrative emerged. Jamila and Darius had been entangled in a hidden relationship throughout their final year of high school. At first, her words brimmed with curiosity and hope, but over time the tone shifted into something darker: doubt, regret, and fear. Darius's replies told an even more disturbing story, growing obsessive, angry, and erratic. One letter in Jamila's delicate handwriting revealed her decision to end things, confessing she no longer felt safe, that she was frightened by who Darius was becoming. His reply was chillingly different, an entire page filled with a single frantic sentence written over and over. "You must still love me." Beneath the stack of letters lay photographs. At first glance, some seemed innocent. Jamila in ordinary places, but others made the officers pause. In several, she appeared restrained, her face betraying fear and confusion. On the backs, Darius had scrawled captions. One read simply, "Had a great time at the cliffs with you." Another repeated the same haunting phrase, "You must still love me." The most harrowing image was of Jamila staring directly into the camera, eyes wide with terror, as though pleading with whoever would someday see it. On the reverse, Darius had written a rambling confession. He could no longer control himself, that people were closing in, that Jamila's refusal left him with no choice. The last line chilled even the most seasoned officers. "I had to kill her, or they would take me. She'll always be in my heart, even if no one ever knows what we had." Before Maurice could process the horror, a shout came from deeper in the woods. Another team had uncovered an area where the earth looked freshly disturbed. With grim urgency, perimeter tape went up and the digging began again. Maurice's breath caught as shovels unearthed fragments of fabric, then bone. Slowly, piece by piece, the past surfaced. A scrap of clothing, a delicate chain, and finally, an ID badge bearing Jamila's name. Maurice stepped toward the line, his hands trembling, his chest tight as though the air itself had turned to stone. After 22 years, the truth had clawed its way into the light. News of Darius Hayes' arrest and the discovery of Jamila Brown's remains spread quickly, shattering Savannah's long silence. A community that had lived in the shadow of mystery now whispered the unthinkable in hushed voices. Media trucks filled the streets, headlines blazed across screens, and neighbors who had once avoided the subject now confronted it openly. For Maurice and Lorraine, the agony of loss intertwined with the unbearable clarity of truth. Detective Ramirez, leading the case, confirmed what the evidence showed and what Darius himself had admitted during questioning. He described luring Jamila to the remote coastal cottage, promising her secrecy and a future together if she abandoned Marcus Hill, her high school boyfriend. But Jamila had refused, telling him with finality that she had hoped for change, but now understood the danger he had become. It was at the cliff's edge, Darius claimed, where everything unraveled. He said she tried to break away, perhaps even shove him aside to escape. Enraged, wounded by her rejection, he overpowered her. His words carried the weight of confession, but not remorse. For Maurice, standing at the edge of the taped clearing, every syllable was a dagger, the confirmation of what his heart had always feared, and the final chapter of a story that had begun on an ordinary spring day in 1990. Darius's confession was stark and brutal. He admitted that in a fit of rage, he had struck Jamila with stones until her body went limp. Panic followed swiftly, and instead of calling for help, he dragged her into the woods near the cottage, burying her beneath soil and silence. It was there, cloaked by time, that forensic teams uncovered her remains, her identity confirmed through dental records and the fragments of clothing that had survived the years. When Detective Ramirez delivered the news in a private briefing, his words were steady, his tone respectful. Lorraine and Maurice listened in silence, their faces etched with grief, but also with the gravity of long-awaited truth. Kendra was there too, her hands locked tightly together in her lap. She confessed she had always wondered why Jamila, in those final months of senior year, had begun asking about Darius. At the time, she dismissed it as passing curiosity. Now she understood it had been the beginning of something dangerous. Lorraine leaned toward her gently, assuring her it was not her fault, reminding her that Jamila's kindness had been twisted against her. Ron Keller, the retired detective who once led the investigation, was also present. His regret was palpable as he admitted Darius had never been a suspect. Jamila's public relationship with Marcus had hidden the truth. That evening, after the formal identification was confirmed, the Browns sat together on their back porch. The sun dipped low, washing the yard in amber light. On the small table between them sat a photograph. Not a stiff portrait, but a candid image of Jamila laughing barefoot on the sand, her hair whipped by the wind. For a long while, neither Morris nor Lorraine spoke. Their silence was not empty this time. It was a fragile peace, settling in after decades of torment. Finally, Lorraine whispered that it was time to move forward, not by letting go, but by holding on to who Jamila had truly been, hopeful, determined, unafraid to see light in even the darkest places. Maurice agreed, remembering how his daughter always wanted to believe the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Lorraine added softly that once Jamila chose to help someone, she never gave up. That trait, she said, was his gift to her. For the first time in years, their grief didn't divide them. It bound them together. They spoke quietly of Jamila's youth, her stubborn faith in love, her hope that people could change. Maurice admitted he wished she had confided in them about Darius, that maybe they could have saved her. Lorraine reminded him gently that they would never know. But what mattered was that Jamila had always known she was loved, and that her parents had never stopped searching. As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared above the pines, they remained on the porch, hands clasped, grief and truth mingling in the quiet air. After 22 years of silence, the story was no longer unfinished. Jamila's voice had been stolen, but her memory had been restored, her truth finally spoken aloud. For the Browns, healing could now begin, not by closing the wound, but by carrying her story with them, always. A week later, the Georgia coast lay shrouded in a thin veil of morning mist. The ocean was still, the marina hushed, as friends, classmates, neighbors, and family gathered. They boarded boats bound for open water, their silence heavy but reverent. It was Jamila's final farewell, not marked by mystery or unanswered questions, but by love, remembrance, and the knowledge that even though her life was stolen, her story would never again be silenced. On that gray morning, Maurice and Lorraine Brown stepped onto the lead boat, accompanied by Detective Keller and Officer Ramirez, the men who had walked beside them in the pursuit of answers. Kendra Williams followed close, holding the secret garden to her chest like a final tether to the past. Each guest carried something: flowers, photographs, letters, small tokens of remembrance that would soon join the ocean. As the boats drifted away from Savannah's shoreline, the city dissolved into mist, and the Atlantic spread out before them, vast and endless. Jamila had once dreamed of studying its mysteries, of mapping currents and exploring coral reefs. That dream had been stolen, but in this moment the sea itself became her final resting place. When the flotilla reached calm waters near Shell Bluff, just beyond the cliffs where Jamila's remains had been found, the engines cut, leaving only the hush of waves lapping against the hulls. Morris stepped forward, the urn cradled in his hands. His voice trembled, but his words were steady as he spoke of his daughter's passion for the ocean, the way she filled notebooks with sketches of tide pools and reefs, the way she vowed as a child that she would one day swim in every sea. "Now," he said, opening the urn, "she belongs to the sea she loved." Ashes rose in the breeze, drifting down to meet the water. Lorraine followed, scattering white hyacinths, Jamila's favorite, until the surface bloomed with petals like a floating garden. One by one, others stepped forward, releasing their offerings: letters, drawings, flowers carried on the tide. Finally, Kendra stepped to the railing, holding the worn book that had bound her to Jamila for over 2 decades. With tears in her eyes, she whispered an apology no one else could hear and released it. The book struck the surface gently, then slowly sank, pages opening as though breathing one last story before vanishing into the depths. No one spoke as the boats turned back toward shore. The silence was its own language, heavy but reverent. Jamila was no longer missing. The word gone had a shape now, painful but defined. That evening, the Browns sat together on their porch as twilight deepened. They did not need words. The stillness between them spoke louder. Lorraine finally reached for Maurice's hand and said she now understood what closure truly meant. Not forgetting, not erasing the pain, but finally knowing. Maurice nodded, admitting he did not feel whole, but he felt closer to peace than he had in 22 years. They had followed every fragile thread, endured every dead end, and refused to let silence have the last word. Jamila's story had been buried, but it was no longer lost. She had been brought home, not to the bedroom frozen in time, not to the pages of a yearbook, but to the truth, and to the sea that she loved. Her name would not fade into a mystery unsolved. It would live on as a memory carried by her family, her friends, and her community. And though the ending was not the one they had prayed for, it was an ending nonetheless. An ending that allowed them to remember Jamila not as a question that haunted them, but as a daughter who had lived, dreamed, and loved. After 22 long years, the silence finally broke. Jamila's story, once buried beneath fear, secrets, and unanswered questions, was brought into the light. For Morris and Lorraine Brown, the pain will never fade. But the truth has given them something closer to peace. Their daughter is no longer a missing face on a poster. She is remembered as a dreamer, a believer in goodness, and a young woman who loved the sea. Stories like this remind us that hope, even when fragile, can still uncover the truth. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these stories should never be forgotten, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more.